You've probably heard it 100 times by now. Millennials don't want stuff. They want experiences. They want to travel, to eat at fancy restaurants, to go to music festivals, to take that Instagram-worthy trip to Southeast Asia. By 2026, 3 out of 4 millennials prefer spending money on experiences rather than buying physical assets. 60% would actually rather travel than save for retirement. That's a staggering shift in how an entire generation thinks about money and happiness. But here's the question that nobody really wants to ask. Was this actually a choice? Or was it a response to a world where the traditional path to wealth has become impossibly expensive? Let's start with what we know. The experience economy is real. Spending on travel, dining, entertainment, and events has exploded over the last 15 years. Millennials grew up in a time of relative abundance and social media. They saw their parents accumulate stuff, and it didn't seem to make them happier. Experiences, on the other hand, create memories. They create content. They create meaning. That's the narrative we've all accepted. But the deeper story is more complicated and more concerning than that. In the early 2000s, a millennial graduating from college might have looked at the traditional wealth-building formula and thought it was achievable. Buy a house, build equity, invest in retirement accounts, climb the ladder. But by the time millennials hit their peak earning years in the 2010s, the math had changed dramatically. Housing prices had disconnected from wages in most major cities. A starter home that cost 3 times your annual salary suddenly cost 6 times, then 8 times, then 10. Student loan debt had skyrocketed. The average millennial graduate in 2015 owed over $30,000 in student loans. That's money that could have gone toward a down payment. That's money trapped before you even start. Retirement savings felt equally out of reach. Pensions had largely disappeared. The stock market had crashed twice in their young adult lives, destroying confidence in traditional investing. And the math on saving for retirement was bleak. If you didn't start at 25, if you didn't have significant capital to invest, if you had student debt and housing costs eating 70% of your income, then retirement accounts felt like a fantasy sold to people with better circumstances. So, here's where the experience economy narrative becomes interesting. It wasn't really a philosophical choice. It was rational economic decision-making under constraint. When the traditional paths to wealth accumulation are blocked, you don't suddenly abandon the desire for security and happiness. You redirect your spending toward things that feel achievable right now. Experiences became the new wealth, because experiences were within reach in ways that houses and retirement accounts weren't. But this is where things get genuinely dark. Because the experience economy creates its own form of wealth inequality and lifestyle inflation that's arguably worse than traditional asset accumulation. When you buy a house, you build equity. When you pay off a car, you own it. But when you spend money on experiences, it's gone, consumed. The only thing left is the memory and the social media content. And that creates a treadmill that most people don't fully understand until they're stuck on it. Let's talk about lifestyle inflation. This is the insidious economic force that keeps you running in place, even when you're earning more money. You get a raise. You feel like you deserve to celebrate. You book a nicer vacation. You upgrade your dining experiences. You buy business class flights instead of economy. Each small upgrade feels justified. Each one feels like you've earned it. But collectively, they consume every dollar of your income growth. The bar keeps rising. Your friends are going to Bali, so a trip to Mexico feels inadequate. Your colleagues are staying at 5-star resorts, so the nice hotel feels cheap. Your social circle is flying business class, so economy starts to feel embarrassing. This is the real trap of the experience economy. It's socially visible in ways that asset accumulation isn't. When you have a nice house, most people only see it if they visit you. But when you travel, when you eat at exclusive restaurants, when you post photos from around the world, everyone sees it. That social visibility creates pressure. It creates comparison. It creates a perpetual upgrade cycle that's nearly impossible to escape once you're in it. And here's the thing that really matters. It's completely unsustainable as a wealth-building strategy. Let's do some actual math. Imagine you're 28 years old. You make $70,000 a year. After taxes and living expenses, you have $800 a month that you can allocate toward either building wealth or experiences. Over the course of your career, that's going to be around $400,000. If you invested it in a diversified portfolio, even with modest 7% annual returns, it would grow to over $1.2 million by the time you're 65. That's the power of time and compound interest. But if you spend it on experiences, you get the memories and the social media content. By 65, you have $0. You have some great photos, you have some great stories, but you don't have retirement savings. You're now part of a generation that will have to work longer, retire poorer, and depend more heavily on government safety nets that are already strained. That's not a judgment. That's just math. The really troubling part is that this choice or this constraint has now become normalized. Younger people are watching millennials prioritize experiences, and they think it's a lifestyle preference rather than a coping mechanism for economic exclusion. So now Gen Z is growing up with the same value system, but in an economy that's somehow even more challenging. Housing costs have continued to rise. Student debt is even higher. Wage growth has stagnated. The job market is increasingly precarious, with gig economy work replacing stable employment. But they've inherited the cultural belief that experiences matter more than assets, that traveling is more important than saving, that the goal is to maximize Instagram moments rather than maximize net worth. And some of this is genuinely valuable. Experiences do create happiness, travel does broaden perspective, shared meals do build relationships. But there's a massive difference between occasionally prioritizing experiences and organizing your entire financial life around them. Let's also acknowledge something important here. The housing market and the retirement crisis aren't problems that individuals created through poor choices. They're systemic problems. Wages haven't kept pace with housing costs in most of the country. Healthcare has become incredibly expensive, which makes retirement savings feel impossible. The burden of education costs has shifted from society to individuals. These are structural problems, not personal failures. But the response to these structural problems has been to tell an entire generation that they should be happy with experiences instead of assets. That they should find fulfillment in travel instead of homeownership. That they should accept precarity and prioritize living in the moment. And while there's something healthy in that message, there's also something deeply troubling. Because it's a way of accepting inequality rather than fighting it. When wealthy people choose experiences over assets, they're choosing between options. They have a paid-off house, they have retirement savings, they have generational wealth. Their choice to prioritize a safari in Kenya over buying another rental property is a real choice. When millennials choose experiences over assets, they're often making that choice because assets feel impossible. That's a fundamentally different situation, but it gets collapsed into the same narrative. So what's the real cost of the experience economy? First, there's the obvious financial cost. A generation that prioritizes spending over saving will have less wealth at retirement. They'll work longer. They'll depend more on government support. That's a personal cost and a societal cost. Second, there's the psychological cost. The experience economy is deeply connected to social media and comparison. It creates constant pressure to upgrade experiences, to go bigger and better, to maintain a certain aesthetic and narrative about your life. That's exhausting, that's anxiety-producing, and it's often hollow. People post photos from Bali and feel miserable. People book expensive dinners and feel like they should be enjoying it more. The experience becomes about the social proof rather than the actual enjoyment. Third, there's the social cost. When experiences are status goods, when travel becomes a way to signal wealth and taste and worldliness, then it becomes exclusionary. It reinforces inequality. People who can't afford to constantly travel start to feel like failures. People who can't participate in this economy start to feel left out of their own generation. That's a corrosive social dynamic. And fourth, there's the environmental cost. The experience economy is energy intensive. It requires constant travel. It requires building hotels and restaurants and entertainment venues. It requires moving people and goods around the world constantly. The carbon footprint of the experience economy is significant, and it's rarely factored into the narrative about why it's so great. The problem isn't experiences. Experiences are valuable. The problem is that an entire generation has been nudged, pressured, and rationalized into prioritizing short-term experiences over long-term security, because the long-term security path has been closed off to them. That's the real story. That's the real cost. So what would actually help? We would need systemic changes. We would need housing policy that makes homeownership achievable for average earners. We would need education costs that don't saddle young people with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. We would need wage growth that actually outpaces inflation. We would need retirement systems that are actually secure. We would need these things not because millennials are making bad choices, but because the economic system itself has become dysfunctional. Until those systemic issues are addressed, the experience economy will continue. And it will continue to feel like a choice when it's actually a constraint. It will continue to be celebrated as a generational preference when it's actually a response to economic precarity. And each person who buys into it will feel like they're living their best life, prioritizing what matters, refusing to be constrained by material possessions. And they'll be right about all of that. But they'll also be slowly giving up on the wealth accumulation that historically has been the path to security for the middle class. The question for the next decade is whether this pattern continues, or whether we actually make some of the systemic changes that are necessary. Because if we don't, we're looking at a generation that reaches retirement age without savings, without housing equity, and without the security that previous generations took for granted. We're looking at younger generations following the same path. We're looking at a society that's fundamentally more unequal and more precarious. The experience economy isn't evil. It's not a moral failing. But it's not a solution to economic exclusion either. It's a coping mechanism. And like all coping mechanisms, it works until it doesn't. It works until you're 65 and there's no retirement fund. It works until the housing market stabilizes and you realize you missed the window to buy. It works until the social pressure becomes unsustainable and you burn out from the constant upgrade cycle. So the real choice in front of us isn't between experiences and assets. It's between acknowledging the systemic problems that are creating this dynamic, or continuing to pretend that individual spending choices are the fundamental issue. Because until we address the real barriers to housing, education, and retirement security, we can't actually have honest conversations about generational preferences. We can only have conversations about generational constraints.